I'm Pippa Moss. I'm a quilter and I live in Suffolk now. I'm originally from Princeton, New Jersey, but I've lived in this country for a long time, since 1978. I've always been interested in quilts, and since moving to England I've really become interested in British quilts and hand quilting particularly. I have a very big collection of Welsh quilts and Durham quilts, but I'm also very interested in Hawaiian quilts, which I hand appliqué and hand quilt. And the way I got into this was quite a while ago. There was a book called Baltimore Beauties and Beyond by Elly Sienkiewicz. I hope I've pronounced that properly. And basically it was a series of lessons where you started with a simple block and you worked your way up to some very complicated baskets and cornucopias. And what I found was that I enjoyed the paper cut blocks, but I didn't really enjoy the fussy ones quite as much. So at that point I made this quilt, which is my Millennium Quilt 2000, and I used hand-dyed fabrics that a friend had made for me. And these are all made with the freezer paper on top technique. Because it was a Millennium Quilt, I didn't want a fussy border, and it took me a long time to come up with this, but New Year's Eve, I thought party streamers, so I came up with this border, which is really New Year's Eve party streamers. The blocks are done by hand appliqué, but I've machine quilted it, and the border is machine appliqué as well, so it's sort of mixed techniques. From there I really went on to, I thought I would go large, so I then started to make the larger Hawaiian patterns, and these are all hand appliqued and hand quilted, and I'm still working, so I just find it enjoyable to come home in the evening and do a bit of hand stitching in front of the television. It's just 2, possibly 3 hours, and not every evening, so it'll probably take about 2 years to complete. But it is the hand quilting which is very time consuming. But the process really is to select your fabrics. The pattern comes from Hawaii, from a company called Poakalani. It comes as a paper pattern, and it's an eighth of a pattern, so you have to choose your fabrics, your appliqué fabrics and your background fabrics, and basically you fold them all into eighths. Your appliqué fabric, once it's very carefully ironed into eighths, you pin your pattern on very securely, and then you can cut it out with very sharp scissors. Obviously this is quite difficult on your hand, so it takes a few days, a little at a time. Once it's all cut out, you can unpick the pattern and unfold it, which is a nightmare because it doesn't want to unfold neatly, but eventually it's unfolded, and you can line the creases in the appliqué fabric with the creases that you've made on your background fabric, and then I pin baste in place so that you can do the hand appliqué. Right, so what I've done is I've cut the pattern out and pin basted it, although traditionally it would have been thread basted, but the pin seemed to work very well. And all I do is I do finger press it, and that seems to make it turn under much easier, and also gives it a smoother edge as well. But it's just a matter of putting a little whip stitch or tack stitch, and you just start at one place and go all the way around. And give it a slight tug just to set the stitch, and really it's the appliqué is very relaxing, very enjoyable. It's really the hand quilting that is the time-consuming part of the process, and the hand quilting really is a bit of a bottleneck, so that's why I've got some of my tops here that are not quilted, but people have enjoyed looking at those as well. Once you've finished an area, you can just take out the pins and they go to be used another time. Right, we've got Molokama there. We've got Carnation here, which is another traditional pattern. This I've done with extra wide fabric, backing fabric. Most of the quilts you would have to seam your 44-inch wide fabric to get the width for the appliqué fabric and also the backing. We've got a top here which is unquilted. You'll notice the difference between the quilted item and the unquilted item. It will get quilted at some point, but this is going to be a monster quilt, so it will be quite a project to actually get it layered up and then to quilt. Here we've got a quilt which was a bit of a learning curve for me. It's a pattern by another designer, Elizabeth Akana, and I had to posterize this to get it to the size I wanted, and I also simplified it a little bit because it had been a larger quilt and I wanted it to be 80 inches square, so a bit of a learning exercise for me. Okay, we've got two unquilted tops, and that's Sunflower, and this is Kipu, and this has a bit of reverse appliqué in there, and that one does as well. The really traditional Hawaiian quilts are red and white. Obviously they had to use whatever fabrics they could find, but generally they used red, blue, yellow or orange on a white background, but I think the red and white is what people would ordinarily think of as Hawaiian quilts, and they're really very striking, I think. Graphically, you know, they're very exciting, I think, so that's really why I like them. I find them enjoyable to do, and then when they're finished they really look quite striking. Yes, this is another very large quilt. I hope I'm pronouncing this properly. Yumeki o Kamahana, who I believe was a very famous king. But again, it's a very large quilt. Again, traditional colors, orange and purple, and these are supposed to be vases with some flowers poking out. But the larger the quilt gets, the more difficult it is really to handle it and to quilt it, obviously. I do quilt in a floor frame, which I find easier, but I shall go back and do some quilting in the appliqué bits. Obviously I was trying to get this ready for this show, so it's more difficult to quilt the appliqué than the background, so at some point I will go back and do that. We've got Kiku nut here. Again, this is a backing fabric, an extra wide fabric, so I didn't have to seam that fabric. This is one with sort of a negative center in purple and cream, and this is called Pilani, and I emailed Sissy and said, what does Pilani mean? And she said, oh, Pilani is one of the greatest Hawaiian kings. So again, all hand appliqued and hand quilted, and this quilt won a prize for best hand quilting because in many ways it's sort of like a whole cloth, isn't it really? But this is one of my favorites. I think the purple and cream works really well. Perhaps I should say that these are not patterns that I have designed. They are traditional patterns from the 1930s and 1940s. Obviously, if you wanted to, you could design your own patterns. That's perfectly acceptable and even encouraged. The patterns that I use are from a company called Puakalani. It's a company that you can Google and it will come up on your browser. And it's a company located in Honolulu in Hawaii. And she has quite a few patterns to choose from. So it's quite interesting to go onto her website and look at her gallery of patterns. Obviously some of them are very large, but she also has pillows, cot quilts, wall hangings, small quilts, and it's always best to start with something small just to see if you like the technique, because not everybody likes appliqué and not everybody likes hand quilting, so just try something small and see if you actually enjoy the technique. Thank you for letting me show you my quilts. I've really enjoyed my time at the Festival of Quilts 2021.